Henry Lewis was a 42-year-old man who had everything: money, power, and status. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding him, he realized one glaring void: an heir. He didn't want a family in the traditional sense. After 2 failed marriages, Henry concluded that love was an illusion, a gamble he had no interest in repeating. But a child was different. An investment, a continuation of everything he had built. Pragmatic to a fault, Henry decided to approach fatherhood like a business deal. He didn't want emotional entanglements or drama. What he needed was someone who would agree to bear his child, sign a contract, and leave when the deal was complete. The next morning, as he drove through the city in his sleek sports car, Henry's mind was preoccupied with finding someone to accept his unusual proposal. He stopped at a red light in a bustling downtown area and noticed a young woman sitting on the sidewalk. She was drawing on a worn piece of paper, her messy brown hair partially obscuring her face. Her thin, disheveled appearance made her almost invisible to others, yet her focused expression and tired but striking blue eyes caught Henry's attention. When the light turned green, he sped away, annoyed by his own curiosity. But a few blocks later he pulled into a parking lot, his thoughts lingering on the woman. "This is ridiculous," he muttered before turning his car around. She was still there, leaning against a wall as she continued sketching. Henry pulled up to the curb, rolled down his window and called out to her, his tone commanding, "Hey you, come here." The woman looked up, her eyes narrowing in suspicion as she assessed the well-dressed man in the expensive car. She hesitated. "I don't have all day," he added impatiently. Reluctantly, she stood and approached the car. Up close, her exhaustion was more apparent, yet there was a resilience in her posture that piqued Henry's interest. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm despite its weariness. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk." "I'm not that kind of woman," she replied sharply. Henry frowned, irritated by the assumption. "This isn't about that. Get in or go back to whatever it is you were doing." After a moment's hesitation, she opened the door and got in. The silence in the car was tense, but Henry didn't seem to mind. He drove to a quiet cafe and led her to a corner table. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla Parker," she replied cautiously. "Why do you care?" Henry leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because I have a proposition for you, one that could change your life." Layla crossed her arms, skeptical. "What kind of proposition?" "I want you to have my child." She blinked, stunned by his bluntness. "You're joking." "I'm not," Henry replied. "This is a serious offer. I'll cover all your expenses during the pregnancy and pay you a substantial amount afterward. In return, you'll walk away with no strings attached." Layla stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or scream. The audacity of his proposal was staggering, yet his demeanor was calm, as if this were just another business deal. "What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger?" she finally asked. "A man who knows what he wants," Henry replied simply. The conversation continued, each of them testing the other's resolve. Layla challenged him, questioning his motives and the morality of his plan, while Henry countered with cold logic and undeniable truths about her precarious situation. By the end of the meeting, Layla's mind was reeling. She left the cafe without giving him an answer, needing time to think. Layla spent the night grappling with the decision. The thought of carrying a child for a man she barely knew felt alien and overwhelming, yet the promise of financial security was tempting. For the first time in years, she had a chance to escape her harsh reality. The next day she showed up at Henry's office, her resolve hardened. "I'll do it," she said. Henry nodded, unsurprised. "Good. Let's finalize the details." Over the next few weeks, Layla's life changed dramatically. She moved into Henry's mansion, a sprawling estate that felt as cold and impersonal as its owner. Despite the luxury, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was a pawn in a larger plan. Henry, meanwhile, kept his distance, monitoring her progress through his assistant, Stephanie. But as the pregnancy progressed, unexpected moments of connection began to surface. One evening they crossed paths in the garden. Henry asked about her drawings, and Layla was surprised he remembered her sketches from that first encounter. Later, he gifted her a set of high-quality art supplies, a gesture that left her both touched and confused. As the months went by, Henry's icy demeanor began to thaw. He accompanied her to medical appointments, and when they heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Layla noticed his growing presence in her life, and although their arrangement remained strictly professional, a fragile bond started to form. And for the first time the future felt uncertain, but not entirely unwelcoming. Walk in the garden, they talked about trivial things. At first, but the conversation soon returned to the babies. Have you thought about names? He asked, surprising her. No, not yet. I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own, she replied. I think it would be fair to do it together, he said. To Lee's amazement, she realized that Henry was trying to be more open, more present. And while she was still cautious, she couldn't ignore that he was making an effort. As the sun set, they sat on a bench in the garden, watching the warm colors of the sky. I never imagined I'd be here doing something like this, Layla said almost to herself. Neither did I, Henry responded with a slight smile. But maybe this is exactly where we need to be. Leah looked at him, noticing that for the first time, Henry seemed to be letting his guard down. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that this wasn't just a contract, but the beginning of something much bigger. The morning started like any other. Lila felt the weight of the months of pregnancy in every movement, but she was determined to keep her routine. Henry, as usual, was in the office, buried in documents. Their interactions, now more frequent, had become a kind of silent comfort for both. But that day something was different. Just before lunch, Layla felt a sudden pain. It was different from any discomfort she had felt before. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another typical pregnancy ache. But the intensity increased. Alarmed, she called Stephanie, who immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. Henry needs to know about this, Stephanie said, helping Lila to sit down. This could be the start of labor. Layla nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain hit her. Stephanie went to get Henry, who appeared in the room within a minute. Seeing her, his usually impassive face showed something rare, genuine concern. Layla, what's happening? He asked quickly. Approaching. I think it's happening, she said, gasping. The babies are coming. For a moment Henry seemed frozen, but he quickly regained control. He grabbed the phone, ordering the driver to get the car ready, and instructing Stephanie to gather everything they would need for the hospital. We're going now, he said, his voice firm but with a touch of urgency that Lila had never heard before. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Lila focused on managing the pain, while Henry, sitting next to her, watched her with a mix of anxiety and determination. He held her hand during the trip, a gesture that seemed automatic but was full of meaning. We're almost there, he said, squeezing her hand gently. You be okay, we'll be okay. Layla didn't respond, but she felt a strange calm from his words. At the hospital, everything happened quickly. A medical team was already on standby, thanks to Henry's meticulous planning, and Lila was taken straight to the delivery room. He stayed by her side the entire time, refusing to leave despite the staff's attempts to get him to wait outside. I'm staying, he said firmly, holding Lila's hand. I'm not going anywhere. During the hours that followed, Henry witnessed something he never imagined. Lee's strength as she brought the twins into the world. Each moment seemed endless, but also filled with an intensity he had never experienced. Finally, the first cry filled the room. The sound was both small and powerful, reverberating like a wave of emotion. A boy, the doctor announced, smiling, a beautiful, healthy boy. Henry felt his heart race. He couldn't take his eyes off the baby being carefully placed on a nearby table before he could fully process what was happening. A second cry filled the room. A girl, his daughter Layla, exhausted but with eyes shining, looked at the two babies being gently cleaned and wrapped in blankets. She wanted to hold them, but she knew the moment would be brief. Henry stood frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor's work. Then, as if something inside him had finally given way, he stepped closer to Lila, took her hand and said, "You were incredible." "Thank you." Silent tears streamed down Lila's face, but she couldn't tell if they were from joy, relief, or a heart already beginning to break soon. After the babies were handed to her, Leah held them carefully, feeling the warmth and fragility of their small lives. She studied them, taking in every detail. Their closed eyes, tiny fingers moving involuntarily. It was an overwhelming love. And she knew it would be impossible to leave them without carrying a part of them forever. Henry stayed by her son's side, silent, but visibly moved when he finally held the boy in his arms. His hardened expression. Henry's hardened demeanor softened in a way Layla had never seen before. As he cradled the newborn girl, his expression transformed, connecting with something far beyond the notion of an heir. It was life in its purest form, a bond he had never experienced. When he held the baby girl close, Henry closed his eyes for a moment as if trying to imprint the sensation into his memory. When he opened them again and looked at Layla, she saw something she never expected: genuine gratitude. "They're perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Layla nodded, still holding the baby boy. Tears streamed freely down her face, but for once she didn't care. This moment was too profound, too sacred. That night, while Layla rested in her hospital room, Henry stayed by the baby's side in the observation area. He watched them sleep, feeling a flood of emotions he didn't know how to control. For the first time he realized that these children weren't just part of a plan or legacy. They were his connection to something greater, to love. Stephanie, carrying a cup of coffee, entered the room quietly. She placed the cup on a nearby table and gently asked, "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" Henry looked at her, struggling to find the right words. "For the first time in a long while, I think it is," he replied. Stephanie smiled and left, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his children. Meanwhile, Layla woke up in her room, feeling an overwhelming sense of loneliness. As much as she wanted to feel happy, she knew the contract still loomed over everything. The babies, now the center of her existence, wouldn't be hers for much longer. But when the door opened and she saw Henry walk in with both babies in his arms, something inside her shifted. He looked different, transformed not just in his relationship with the babies but also with her. Henry approached the bed, handed her the boy, and sat beside her holding the girl. "I don't know how, but this has changed everything," he confessed, looking at the twins. Layla nodded, knowing that no matter how difficult the future would be, this moment was a miracle she would never forget. Months later, Henry's mansion was steeped in heavy silence. Layla knew what the day meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been a mix of joy and anguish. She loved them more than she ever thought possible, but the contract was clear. Her time there was coming to an end. Today was the day she was supposed to leave everything behind. Packing her belongings into a small suitcase, Layla glanced at the babies' cribs, where they slept peacefully. Tears threatened to fall, but she refused to cry. She didn't want her last memories to be marked by weakness. She had signed the contract and she tried to convince herself it was the right thing to do. Stephanie knocked softly on the door, entering with a worried expression. "Is everything ready?" she asked quietly. Layla nodded, swallowing her emotions. "Yes. Thank you for everything, Stephanie." Stephanie hesitated before speaking. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis." Layla forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. "It's not about what I want. It's about what was agreed upon." Stephanie didn't press further. She simply left the room, promising to let Henry know Layla was ready to leave. When Layla descended the stairs with her suitcase in hand, she found Henry waiting in the foyer. He stood by the front door, his eyes fixed on her. There was no trace of the cold, calculating man she had met at the beginning. The Henry standing there seemed different, vulnerable, as if he was about to lose something important. "Everything's ready," Layla said, breaking the silence. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step towards her, his gaze intense. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. Layla felt a lump in her throat but remained firm. "That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on." Henry stood still for a moment before reaching into the inside pocket of his coat and pulling out the contract. He held the document between his fingers as if it were something insignificant. "This contract," he began, his voice steadier now, "should never have defined what's happening between us." Before Layla could respond, Henry tore the paper into pieces, letting them fall to the floor. The sound echoed through the foyer like a declaration. "I don't want you to go, Layla. I don't want this to end here." Layla froze, her eyes fixed on the pieces of paper on the floor. Her heart raced, but pain and fear kept her hesitant. "Henry, you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple." He took another step towards her, his expression full of emotion. "I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me. But these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Layla. Not just because of the twins, but because you brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." His words hit her hard, but she shook her head, trying to resist. "And how do I know this is real?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can I trust that you won't change your mind? That you won't pull away when things get tough?" Henry took a deep breath, seeming to struggle with his own insecurities. "Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You showed me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this. Lose you." Layla felt tears streaming down her face, but there was still a barrier she couldn't overcome. "I fell in love with you, Henry," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. "But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same?" Henry moved closer, now so near that she could feel his breath. "Because you changed everything for me, and I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, Layla, but I'm willing to try every day for the rest of my life, if you give me that chance." His words were like a blow to her defenses. Layla felt something inside her about to give way. She knew there were risks, but for the first time she considered that maybe it was worth facing them. "What if it doesn't work out?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Henry took her hands, looking directly into her eyes. "Then we'll try again. And again if necessary. I won't give up on you, Layla. Never." For a moment the world seemed to stop. Layla felt her doubts begin to fade, replaced by something stronger: hope. She looked at Henry, realizing that he was truly willing to let go of his control and his barriers to be with her. Finally she nodded, letting the tears fall freely. "Okay, I'll stay." Henry let out a sigh of relief and pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time, Layla felt that this was where she was meant to be. Months after their intimate wedding, Henry and Layla found themselves settled into a life neither could have imagined when they first met. The once cold mansion was now filled with warmth, the laughter of their children echoing through the halls, the comforting scent of freshly baked cookies, and the quiet moments of love shared between them. Henry, who had spent years building walls to keep emotions at bay, had fully embraced fatherhood and the vulnerability that came with it. Every day he proved his commitment to being not just a provider but a devoted partner and father. Layla, once hesitant to trust and afraid to hope, had finally found a home where she belonged, not just in the grand house but in Henry's heart and in the bond they had created as a family. Their journey wasn't without challenges. Late nights caring for fussy twins, navigating the complex world of parenthood, and learning to communicate through their differences tested them. But these moments only strengthened their connection, reminding them that love was about more than grand gestures. It was about the everyday choices to stay, to support, and to grow together. As the twins toddled across the sunlit garden one afternoon, Layla and Henry sat side by side, watching them explore. Layla turned to Henry, her eyes shimmering with a blend of contentment and wonder. "Can you believe this is our life now?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Henry smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I never dared to dream it could be," he admitted. "But you taught me how to dream again." The twins, hearing their parents' voices, looked up and babbled excitedly, toddling over to be scooped into their embrace. In that moment, surrounded by their children and the love they had built, Henry and Layla knew they had rewritten the ending to their story. It wasn't a fairy tale, nor was it perfect, but it was theirs, messy, beautiful, and full of the kind of love that defied expectations. And that was enough. What do you think of Henry's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories, and don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.